L'applauso è per il professor David Card, ovviamente. Un breve saluto e per me è davvero un grande onore a nome della banca, ma anche mio personale, dare oggi il benvenuto al professor David Card. Il professor Card è stato, ha vinto il premio Nobel per l'economia nel 2021 insieme a Guido W. Imbens e Joshua Engrist per il loro contributo empirico allo studio del mercato del lavoro. I suoi studi, le sue analisi lo rendono un punto di riferimento proprio a livello internazionale sui temi legati alla determinazione dei salari, all'istruzione, all'immigrazione e al grande tema della disuguaglianza. In questo workshop avremo il piacere di ascoltarlo su un argomento di grandissimo interesse e, siccome siamo in una banca, vorrei dire di grande rilevanza anche per gli intermediari finanziari. L'innovazione tecnologica, la digitalizzazione, lo sviluppo dell'intelligenza artificiale, l'ingresso nel mercato di nuovi operatori come le big tech, stanno radicalmente modificando l'operatività delle banche. E le sfide che questo mutamento porta con sé richiedono soluzioni sempre nuove, perché bisogna cercare di bilanciare i bisogni della clientela, il miglioramento dei livelli di produttività e la sostenibilità del modello di business, ma senza mai perdere di vista la centralità delle persone come i colleghi, le persone che lavorano in banca, le persone nostri clienti. Quindi evolvono le necessità di competenze richieste a chi lavora nel sistema finanziario. Quindi è necessario un progressivo upgrade delle competenze di carattere più tecnico, con l'obiettivo sia di conseguire guadagni di efficienza e migliorare la qualità dei servizi offerti, ma anche di proteggere i dati dei clienti. Il tema della privacy è essenziale. Quindi assumono grande rilevanza anche le cosiddette soft skills, come la capacità di leggere, di capire il contesto operativo e di anticiparne i cambiamenti, la flessibilità, lo spirito di adattamento, l'intraprendenza. Un ulteriore aspetto critico è quello della demografia. L'aumento dell'età media della popolazione determina un'incidenza crescente dei lavoratori appartenenti a fasce di età più senior. In Italia circa il 38% degli occupati nel 22 aveva un'età compresa tra i 50 e i 64 anni, aggiungendo gli over 65, quindi me compreso, saliamo al 40%. Quindi la sfida imposta dal boom della tecnologia, concluderei che è molto complessa, coinvolge sia chi non è ancora entrato nel mondo del lavoro, ma che deve fare delle scelte appropriate. Vedo moltissimi giovani, mi fa molto piacere questo, mentre chi è già nel mondo del lavoro deve continuare ad avere una fase di apprendimento, un apprendimento continuo, tenere il passo con il mondo che cambia. Credo di aver già detto abbastanza e lascio volentieri e con piacere la parola a Tito Boeri per una sua introduzione sul tema e su David Card. Prego Tito.
Grazie Gregorio. No, in realtà So che per esigenze di streaming dobbiamo chiudere in un'ora, anzi meno di un'ora, entro le 5 a questo punto, e quindi davvero non voglio portarvi via tempo. D'altra parte ho già avuto l'onore di introdurre David Card in edizioni precedenti del festival, quindi mi limiterò semplicemente a dire due cose. La prima è che l'impatto, il grandissimo impatto che il lavoro di David Card ha avuto nella nostra professione può essere misurato quantitativamente da alcuni indici. Il primo è il numero di citazioni che ha raccolto in campo accademico. Bene, David Card ha ricevuto quasi 100.000 citazioni, è davvero un numero enorme. E la cosa interessante è che quasi un terzo di queste sono dopo il 2019. Questo dimostra il fatto che ha una produttività crescente nel tempo. E tra l'altro una cosa che notavo, e di cui ne parlavo anche precedentemente con lui, e che mi fa sperare tanto, è che queste sue ripetute, anche venute in Italia, viaggi in Italia, lo portino a indirizzare di più la ricerca sul nostro paese. Ha in effetti una serie di progetti di ricerca sull'Italia che sono estremamente promettenti, sia sul tema della contrattazione salariale che sul tema delle carriere e delle differenze di genere nelle carriere professionali. Una seconda misura dell'impatto e chiaramente sono i riconoscimenti, i premi che vengono dati, che sono molto difficili perché a parte questo piccolo premio che si chiama premio Nobel, esistono tanti altri premi che David ha preso, John Bates Clark Medal, Liza Prize for Labor, e tantissimi altri. Bene, ne ho contati di questi che sono davvero premi molto difficili, riconoscimenti ben 22 nel suo curriculum. E poi ci sono gli inviti a tenere delle lecture molto prestigiose e qui c'è una pagina intera nel suo curriculum di inviti a lecture. Quindi questo vi dà l'idea del grandissimo impatto che il suo lavoro ha avuto. In edizioni precedenti del festival ci siamo occupati del suo contributo all'analisi per esempio dei salari minimi e gli effetti dei salari minimi, abbiamo parlato moltissimo della misurazione dei rendimenti dell'istruzione. Oggi ci parlerà di qualcosa che è legato all'innovazione tecnologica e alla rincorsa che c'è tra domanda e offerta di talenti e in particolare di persone che si specializzano e hanno competenze informatiche. Questo è un quesito fondamentale perché, come molte altre lezioni che noi stiamo ascoltando in questi giorni, è davvero decisivo che ci sia una capacità da parte nostra, diciamo dell'umanità, di reagire a questi sviluppi tecnologici facendo un upgrade, se vogliamo, un miglioramento delle nostre competenze e dobbiamo imparare a dialogare, a entrare in contatto con questi supercalcolatori per certi aspetti che spesso sono l'intelligenza artificiale. E siccome l'adozione sta avvenendo di queste nuove tecnologie ad una rapidità impressionante, l'indagine che è stata presentata qui all'inizio del festival ci dice che in Italia 7 italiani su 10 già adesso in qualche modo sanno cos'è ChatGPT e hanno esposizione a ChatGPT, è una cosa impensabile. In 5 mesi la rapidità in cui queste cose si sono sviluppate, noi dobbiamo procedere in questo sviluppo di queste nuove competenze in modo estremamente rapido, per cui ecco, il ritmo con cui questo avviene è qualcosa di davvero molto molto importante, ma non voglio portare via, ripeto, altro tempo al discorso di David Card, che invito a questo punto alla lezione e ringrazio una volta di più. Un'altra cosa che volevo dire è una lezione di metodo di David. David quando viene al festival non viene per fare il suo discorso e poi se ne va, ma rimane qui durante tutto il festival e sarà presente anche nell'evento di chiusura del festival in cui cerchiamo di trarre un po' le somme di tutto quello che è stato detto in questi giorni. E questo è un esempio di grandissima serietà, proprio è sempre stato questo il suo modo di interpretare il suo ruolo e di questo davvero gli siamo molto riconoscenti. David.
Thank you, Tito, for that kind introduction. Very nice to be here. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I'm going to talk a little bit about how the tech boom is affecting the labor market and some of the implications of that for particularly high-skilled workers. So probably everyone knows that the new technologies mainly associated with computers, internet, technology have really led to a lot of changes in the labor market. One of the most remarkable changes is the rise of these big five companies, Alphabet, Amazon, Apple, Meta, and Microsoft, which four of these have grown from almost nothing or just starting in the early 2000s to become among the most valuable companies in the world. If you look at their annual revenues, you can see just how remarkable this growth is. So from a base of a very small amount in 2000s, we're up to $1.6 trillion. Just to give a sense of what is $1.6 trillion, the GDP of Italy is $2 trillion. So these five companies have annual sales that's not within striking distance of the Italian GDP. Now, how has that affected the labor market? There's a variety of ways, but the most direct way it's affected the labor market is it's led to a remarkable increase in the demand for workers with computer science and computer science adjacent skills. So these are skills involving quantitative analysis, data analysis kind of skills. One of the really remarkable features is there's a whole new field called data science that's emerged in the last 10 years. And these workers are not just working at these big five firms, they're working all over the world in all kinds of firms, and even at universities and banks and around all kinds of jobs, taking advantage of the products that these companies and others have been able to innovate on. So just to show how this is affecting things, let's look at new college graduates. So this is people with a bachelor's degree in the United States over time. And I'm showing here the annual salaries in US dollars, adjusted for inflation. And I'm comparing a bunch of different fields. The red one at top is computer science and electrical engineering. And for those of you who don't know, computer science and electrical engineering are often the same department. At Berkeley, that's called EECS. EECS, but other places they're somewhat different. And as a way of benchmarking, you can think of other engineering fields. Engineering fields are traditionally good-paying jobs. And then at the bottom, unfortunately, the liberal arts group. Now, just to make this relevant for the top firms, what I've shown here is the 90th percentile of wages. So these are not the wages that the average worker gets in these fields, but these are the wages that sort of the top people, and most of those would be working in big companies like the Big Five and others. And you can see what's happened from a base where computer science and electrical engineering graduates, now these are only 24 to 27-year-olds, okay, so these are very young people. From a base where they were earning about the same as graduates in other engineering departments, they're now earning 30-40% more in a course of just a few years. Now, just to make, since I know this is the Festival of Economics, you might be wondering, well, what happened to economics? I know you are. We don't do too badly. And so that's, I think, an example of what I call CS adjacency. We are lucky in that many of our graduates have many of the same skills that they're looking for or that complement the skills of computer science and data science people. So we've benefited from this much more than you might have thought if you just looked at our traditional curriculum. If we want to look a little bit more precisely, the Bureau of Labor Statistics in the United States provides data on very precise job titles. And here's what's called a software development engineer. If you want to sound like you work in the tech industry, you call these SDEs. Okay, and so SDEs, in 2010, there was about 900,000 of them in the United States. And over the next 13 years, that number basically doubled. If you look at their median salary, it went from 90,000 to 130,000 in real terms. And if you look at their 90th percentile of SDEs, it's now at around $210,000. Now, that's a lot of money for somebody who most of these people only have a bachelor's degree. So this is not master's degree necessarily. Most of the people who are working as SDEs have just a bachelor training. If we look at other fields, this is the field I was mentioning, the field of data science. In 2010, BLS didn't actually code this occupation, so this is a new occupation. By 2023, there's close to 200,000 of these guys in the economy. Now, there's almost no bachelor programs in data science. There's a few starting at places like Berkeley that have been pushing hard on the frontier. So many of these people have some combination of a bachelor's degree and maybe a master's, 1 year of training or 2 years of training in data science. And they're doing pretty well, too. If you look at their median salaries, a little over 100, and their 90th percentile is 184. What about these fields that are sort of comparable? So here's data for 3 other fields: statisticians, economists, and mechanical engineers. I put mechanical engineers here because that's the largest single field in engineering. That's usually a relatively high-paying field. It's been, for the last century, one of the best occupations to get into in the United States. Those were people that would ultimately work building cars or airplanes or things like that, or helping to do that. So you can see the number of statisticians and economists is tiny. Now, part of it is the way that those are defined in the US. Most of the people that this agency counts as statisticians or economists are people with a PhD. There are a few people with bachelor's and master's degrees working, but compared to the software development engineers or even data scientists, we're tiny. There's 190,000 people. That's like more economists than have ever been produced in the entire world. So that's a lot of people in data science in just 10 or 12 years. And you can see that, again, this should make the economists in the room feel good. The economists are doing pretty well in terms of our salaries. We're not quite up there with the SDEs, but at the 90th percentile, we're doing very well. And in contrast to mechanical engineers, which has always been a decent job, is more stable, as we saw before. So the question is, what's going on in response to this incredible rise in demand? And that's what I really want to focus on for the rest of the talk, because I think that's really where there's something that's important for not just for the US, but for other countries. So by way of background, in the US, there's been a steady increase in the number of bachelor's degrees awarded. Say from 2010 to 2020, it went up by around 18%. Not all of these bachelor's degrees are super high quality. So a lot of rise in bachelor degree education in the United States is occurring at what are called for-profit universities. The traditional research universities have been much more stable. So the institutions like the University of California, Berkeley, or UCLA, NYU, Columbia, Harvard, those kind of places have been much more stable in their enrollments. And a lot of this enrollment is at you might think of as almost second-tier universities. What about the field shares? Well, when I started working on this talk, I knew that there had been some rise in computer science graduates, but if you actually look at the graphs, it's not a huge rise. So this is the fraction of people graduating with different bachelor's degrees. And I have to say that different data sets give different answers on exactly how this looks, but they all show some increase in computer science, so that's the engineering and computer science, but from a pretty low base. So in 2010, around 3% of all graduating BAs were in computer science, and by 2020, it's around 6%. So it's a doubling, but it's still a relatively small field. Quite a bit bigger than economics, by the way. What's really dominating the picture is the health professions. And the health professions have become extremely important, not just in the United States, but around the world. And there's a couple reasons for that. One is, which was mentioned in the introduction, demography. So there's a lot more old people, and they need a lot of health care. And we're spending a lot of money on their health care. And so there's a booming labor market for these jobs. And part of it is also that some of the rise in healthcare graduates reflects the fact that some of the jobs in healthcare, like nursing, were traditionally outside of universities. And in the last 3 decades have all moved inside universities. So now a registered nurse in the United States has a bachelor's degree, whereas historically that was not the case. And that's a fairly large field, quite an important field. Similarly with things like physical therapy. And a lot of those fields are dominated by women, and so that's a very positive development. As women have become a larger share of graduates, more people are going into health. And so that's sort of a background factor that you need to, when you look at the figure, you're sort of thinking what's going on there. Now, here's an aside. I wanted to put in a little content for Italy. So you could ask yourself the following question. We see in the United States that the share of graduates getting a degree in computer science went from 3% to around 6% in the last 15 or so years. How does that look compared to other countries? Luckily for me, the OECD has a recent table on that, and here's some of the data from their table. Now, of course, I've circled the United States, but we want to start at the top with Italy, which is quite remarkable situation. Italy started with the lowest share of graduates in computer science and really hasn't moved at all. United States was at around 3%, as I said, and it's gone to around 5.5%. You can see that. Very interesting to compare, for instance, Sweden and Ireland with the United States for 2 reasons. One is they started at about the same place, around 3% of graduates in that field. They've grown more than the United States, and yet, if you think about it, the real rise in demand for computer science is right in the US. That's where everybody wants to go to get those jobs. So, in a way, some of these other countries are responding more efficiently than the US. And I don't show it on the graph here, but actually the country that the OECD highlights is showing among the set of countries that show the fastest rise in computer science are the Baltic countries, which have really moved quickly to change their education system and are now turning out close to 10% of their graduates in computer science. So I think that's an interesting model. Israel shows up pretty strongly here. Everybody knows that's got a strong tech sector. And Finland, which started at a very high rate. So there are probably lessons for all the countries that are at the bottom of the league here in terms of what's going on in these other countries. And I haven't really dug into that, but I think it's something that I'm going to talk about, the US experience. Okay, so what this suggests is that the rise in the CS share, computer science share in the US, looks about average relative to the rest of the world. So what's going on? Is it basically because Americans don't like computer science, or they like it a little bit, but you really have to drag them into computer science? Or are there other institutional barriers, some walls that we're not seeing? And of course, I can never pass up a chance to highlight Pink Floyd. Now, it turns out one of my recent PhD students, Zach Bleemer, and a co-author, have a very interesting, very recent paper making a really important point about this institutional barriers issue. So what they did was they surveyed major US universities and tried to find out how many restrictions are in place preventing you from entering into different majors. So if you're a European, you might not know that in most majors in the United States, you do not apply to the major. You apply to the school, and then after a couple of years, you go into the major. And normally, it's kind of a supply-driven system. So in the idealized world, if you want to study Latin and Greek, you can do that. If you want to study economics, you can do that. But in the last 25 or 30 years, that has really changed. 2 things have happened. One thing that's happened is a lot of specialized majors have introduced a system where you actually apply from high school. Now, that was always the case in engineering in the United States, but in the last few years, it started to apply to computer science, even to economics. So at Berkeley, even in economics, now you have to apply to economics. A second thing that's happened, or kind of corresponding to that, is that a lot of the departments have introduced minimum requirements. So you basically take a couple of courses in your first few years, and if you do well enough, we'll let you in. And they're doing that to ration students, because students want to take certain classes, and the university doesn't want to respond. So Bleemer and Mehta categorize these restrictions in a couple of ways. So they called discretionary restrictions, restrictions where you basically have to apply to the major before college or through some kind of formal system. Then they call mechanical restrictions, restrictions that are based on how well you've done in coursework. So mechanically you have to achieve a certain grade in your first year courses in economics or in computer science to get in. And a few schools actually require not just that you do well in the major, but you have to do well overall. Actually, a surprising number of schools require that. And these kind of restrictions are most common for computer science, engineering, business, and economics. What do these majors have in common, you might say? And I think probably everybody knows. They're the high-paying majors. So this is a very unusual data set. This is a data on the average salaries by field for Berkeley graduates. So now we're not mixing up, bad universities and good universities. Everybody in this diagram was a graduate of UC Berkeley, and in most cases would have applied to UC Berkeley and then chosen a major. Okay? So they have gotten into Berkeley, take some courses, and then choose a major. And you can see in that setting that computer science is at the very top. Business is second. Economics is third. Mechanical engineering is fourth. And basically, I don't show too many of the low-performing ones, but the humanities major is at the bottom. And there's quite a large gap. It's more than 100% higher salary, even at ages 23 and 24. And by the time you accumulate it up over the entire career, you're talking well over 100% higher earnings for somebody in these selective majors than the non-selective majors, or the harder and easier to get into. So these restricted majors have in common that they're the high premium majors. And here's the data that Bleemer and Mehta put together. So the green bar is is a fraction of schools in their big sample where there's no restrictions. And amongst all majors, about 45% have no restrictions. But among the high premium majors, the ones we just talked about, only a quarter have no restrictions. And you can see that the set of restrictions is a combination, but mostly it's these mechanical restrictions and a few of direct application restrictions, which mainly affect engineering and computer science. So what you can see very clearly from these charts is that getting into a high premium major isn't just what you want to do, it's what you're able to do given the constraints in the system. So it seems like universities are rationing access to these really valuable majors, and potentially dampening the way that the education system is able to respond to these incredible shocks that have come from the new technology boom. Now, in defense of the universities, you might say, well, we have to do that because, computer science is very hard. And we don't want any, just the ordinary bozos in the computer science program. It's not going to be good for them. And it's a little bit hard to know whether that's true or not in general, but the same two dudes, Bleemer and Mehta, have an earlier study where they look specifically at that question, although they look in the context of economics. And this is a very interesting paper. They're studying economics at a sister university to Berkeley. It's the University of California, Santa Cruz. That's where you go if you want to basically get a degree and learn how to surf at the same time. I definitely recommend it for people that like surfing. Anyway, UC Santa Cruz, it should say SC, not SD. It should be Santa Cruz, so I mistyped here. UC Santa Cruz has a very strict major limit, a GPA on your first years in economics to whether you can get into economics or not. And they do an analysis that economists call a regression discontinuity analysis. Some of you will have seen this kind of analysis before, where you compare the fraction of kids who get into the major, ultimately, against their average GPA in economics 1 and 2. Okay, so you students take Economics 1 and Economics 2, and then if they have a high enough grade, you need to get a 2.7, then you can enter the major. And you can see if you don't quite make the threshold, you have a lower probability, something like 40%. And how do you get into the major even if you're below the threshold? Well, everybody who goes to university knows you go and talk to the associate dean, and then you hang out in front of the office for a while, and you beg and plead, and you take Economics 1 another time. Or you can take a calculus course and say, well, I did pretty terrible in my first year, but it's because I was learning to surf. And now that I've got the surfing straight, I've decided to bear down, and I decided I'll show you how well I can do with these other courses. So you can do it, but there's still this fairly significant barrier, about almost a 40% gain if you just pass that threshold. So what do you do with that? Well, you then ask, well, what happens then to the earnings later on in life for the people who didn't quite make the threshold and the people who did? Are they better off or not? And what we're thinking about here is two scenarios. One scenario is, yes, economics is good for everybody, and we're just rationing demand. The other scenario is, well, if we put these low performers in economics, they're not going to do well anyway, because economics is a tough subject, and marginally qualified people just aren't going to make it. And here's what the graph looks like. You can see about $8,000 a year for the rest of your life if you actually make that threshold and you're a UC Santa Cruz graduate. So that is an enormous, enormous return to doing well in Economics 1 and 2. And you can see what's led to my concern, and Bleemer and Mehta's work has really emphasized this, my concern that we're probably rationing these slots in a way that is not very good for the students. Why don't we just have more economics slots and allow more people to go in? So these comparisons between students who just passed or failed the entry threshold suggest very large payoffs. If you think about it per student who moved, it's around $20,000 per year. The $8,000 is just the difference between people above and below the threshold, but remember, some of the people below the threshold got in. So if you take account of just what fraction of people get in, it amounts to $20,000 per year to go to economics. So economics can probably make you rich relative to the alternative. Now, what's going on in part is Santa Cruz University is right next to Silicon Valley. So if you graduate in economics from Santa Cruz, you could go right over to Silicon Valley and get one of these high-paying jobs. If you don't, it's much, much harder to do that. So given the student demand, obviously there's a lot of students who want to get into these things, and the strong outcomes, why do schools limit entry? And my explanation for that is that basically universities want to keep their faculties more stable. They don't want to have a big increase in the number of economists and computer scientists at the expense of other fields. And there's some potential reasons for that, but I think it's something that is having a huge social cost. So if we're thinking about how the boom has affected the labor market, I would say the salaries of computer science and computer science adjacent fields have risen sharply. The numbers of students in those occupations has risen, but the growth in new students entering those fields has been tempered by major restrictions. So about 75% of universities in the United States are restricting entry to these high premium majors, which are going to lead to these computer science predictions. So I'm going to end, this is my last slide, I'm going to end with 3 predictions. I think that if you have this incredible demand and really high salaries in the tech sector for computer science and data science type skills, there's going to be more competition for kids to get into those programs. And what that's going to do is it's going to ration out kids that are a little bit more disadvantaged. And it's very clear from data from Berkeley, data from Santa Cruz, data from other schools that I've heard of, that that's mainly it's going to have a larger impact on kids from disadvantaged backgrounds. So if you come from a slightly lower income family, if you come from a minority family, you're more likely to be close to that threshold and not quite make it. And so this is going to have very bad effects in terms of equality of opportunity going forward for the next generation. The larger wage gaps between majors are also going to magnify inequality, and they're particularly magnifying the gender gap, because only 20% of the graduates in computer science in the United States are female. Very large fraction are male. Similarly, engineering, similarly, economics, similarly, business. So the male-dominated fields are really pulling ahead, and that's, if anything, enhancing the gender gap, going the wrong way. And finally, what this is doing is it's increasing the demand for foreign workers. So in the tech companies, they basically go to the government every year and say, we can't get the people we need to bring in 150,000 bachelor's degrees from outside the US to work in the computer science industry. So I think that my prediction is that these three factors are also at work in other countries where students are responding to the opportunities, but the education system is not. And I think that that's an important thing for economists and people interested in this whole area to think about and to ask, how can we better help the next generation take advantage of the remarkable demands that are coming in the tech sector? And I'll stop there, and we have a bit of time for questions.